Brace yourself. 2024 is the year of worldwide elections right across the planet. I mean, by one estimate, there will be at least 50 national elections in which over 4 billion people will vote, and that will determine the path ahead for governments of all shapes and sizes, and indeed, the future of democracy. I'm Evan Mawarire, and this is the Frontlines of Freedom. If you listened to President Biden's opening campaign speech, the very idea of democracy, a concept on which the United States was founded, is facing a very real threat in the 2024 election.
Today, we're here to answer the most important of questions. Is democracy still America's sacred cause?
Biden essentially repeated that theme throughout his entire speech, which was delivered pointedly at Valley Forge. But, to me, as an outsider, one who has always looked at America as a bastion of democracy, the very idea of that speech is confounding. In fact, it's concerning. And that's not because it's bad or wrong, but because it had to be said in the first place. Democracy has clearly become a campaign issue in 2024. And we need to be thinking very deeply about how far we've come, about what has happened to us, and what matters to us in this season. Obviously, there's more to come on that particular front as the year progresses, but it has to be said that now would be a good time to strengthen up and continue to be the beacon of freedom. I want to turn to another threat to democracy. On the other side of the world, there's a crucial fight there that many Americans seem to either have forgotten or just become weary of hearing. Ukraine valiantly continues a battle for its very existence. And it's a battle against a Russian army that, despite significant losses, still has vastly superior resources, including rockets and artillery supplied by North Korea, according to U.S. intelligence reports. Remember how we said in the last episode that autocrats are working together? Well, this is exactly what we mean. The struggle to keep Ukraine democratic and free has in many ways fallen off the front pages of the news here in the United States. And while many in the U.S. Congress actively oppose offering any further support, where will that leave Ukraine? Is there any hope for this beleaguered sovereign nation to somehow defend themselves, or perhaps even win this war? Well, my guest today says yes. Malcolm Nance is an ex-U.S. Navy intelligence officer and a former MSNBC contributor, and also a New York Times bestselling author. Malcolm, thank you for being with me here today.
So glad to be here.
You're a Ukrainian legionnaire. Mm-hmm. Help us understand, I mean, you served in the U.S. military.
Right.
You retired, and when Russia invaded Ukraine, you put on your uniform and you went onto the front lines. Walk us through you making that decision and what it was like and what it's like now on the front lines in Ukraine.
Well, as you know, in making the decision to go back to Ukraine and fight as opposed to report, as you know, I was with MSNBC television, and I was doing a study there, not for MSNBC, but for a think tank, about the Russian invasion routes into Ukraine. I met great people. I went down to their southern battlefront and Avdiivka, met with the commanders of the Ukrainian armed forces, and saw that this was a nation that was a democracy that was choosing and had chosen in 2014 not to align itself with Moscow and become a puppet state of Moscow like Belarus is, right? They wanted independence. They wanted to align themselves with the West. They wanted the values of the West. Ukraine is not a dictatorship. Okay, they've had 9 different elections. They elected pro-Moscow governments. They elected pro-European governments.
Right.
But it was when a pro-Moscow government decided to throw them into dictatorship under Vladimir Putin that they rose up in 2014, and had their revolution of dignity and shook off the shackles of a Russian dictatorship. So when I went there, I found the place was amazing. It's a beautiful country, an extremely clean country. People have these images of Eastern Europe. It just did not apply to Ukraine. And then as the invasion was becoming more and more imminent, and I was on air, warning this invasion was going to happen.
Right.
I became concerned that, what was my role going to be? Was I going to go back to the United States and point to arrows on a map on television from 11 p.m. till 4 in the morning, some oddball time, and then once I got home, I left Ukraine by complete accident on the night of the invasion. I was on the last Lufthansa flight out of the country, and when I landed in Dublin, I stayed overnight in Dublin, and Putin was making his speech. And I knew by the end of that speech, missiles were already flying.
Right.
And I was getting phone calls from people who were there saying, hey, air raid sirens are going off. We're under attack.
Right.
And I committed at that moment. I said, there's no way I'm going to allow, a non-democratic ex-KGB officer to come to this country and to wipe it out without having something to say about it.
So you took this personally and decided, I am going back. Yeah. Talk to us about, what does victory for Ukraine look like, number one? Why is it important, number two?
Well, first, let me talk about number two. Okay, the Ukraine war is a war of existence for that nation.
Right.
Russia has made it an existential threat. They said very clearly they intended to take the country in 3 days, and that they would topple the government, they would execute all of the senior government officials and military officials, many of whom I had met and had become friends with.
Right.
So for me, it was an affront, all right, a personal affront to watch what people must have seen in 1939 when Hitler rolled into the Sudetenland, then rolled into Poland and, worked with the communists to split Poland in half and then set his sights on everything else.
Right.
And it just struck me that I was not going to take this. I mean, I had skill. I was an intelligence official for decades. Even though I didn't speak Ukrainian, I spoke some Russian. And President Zelensky had announced the formation of the International Legion, which is a Ukrainian army combat unit.
Right.
And I went back, joined the Legion, and I was immediately tasked out to Ukrainian intelligence for my first 2 months.
Right.
Because the frontline combat units hadn't completely formed. The Ukrainian army was fighting and holding down, but the Ukrainians were smart. They knew that this was going to be a long war.
Right.
So let me answer your first question now. What does victory look like? You've already seen victory. You've already seen victory.
We have?
Yeah.
Walk me through it.
Because Ukraine was supposed to have fallen in days. 2 weeks at the most. Let me tell you something. I made an on-air report about a week before the invasion, where I had myself, a couple of other political analysts, and an academic, and they were saying, Kyiv is going to fall. Kyiv is going to fall immediately. The Ukrainians can't stop what the Russians are throwing at them. And I demurred. I said, look, I have been with these people. There's a factor you are not including in any of your reporting. None of you are including the Ukrainian army. I said, they have an army. I've met this army.
Right.
They are in the field. They've been in the field for weeks with their full combat loads out there. I said, I'm sorry to tell you, the city of Kyiv is never falling, ever. They are going to beat them on the ground. I've been on the roads. All they are going to do, I said, when you see those arrows pointing on a map, I'm telling you what you're pointing to, tank graveyards. And so everyone just couldn't even believe that this was my assessment after spending, some months in Ukraine. And I go, look, they are going to win this thing because they have heart, they have guts, and they are fighting not to destroy the man in front of them, but to protect the people behind them that they love. And I hadn't seen this in very many wars, ever.
I love the way you framed it. We've already seen victory. Yeah. But Malcolm, here's the reality. Ukraine still needs support.
Sure.
And this conversation about supporting Ukraine is raging in America right now. What are the consequences of not supporting Ukraine, of America pulling out and saying we're tired, of saying we have our own problems at home? What are we facing down the line if we don't help Ukraine to further secure the victory that they need?
Well, if we see these political acts play out and we are not going to support Ukraine or piecemeal support Ukraine at the level that they need it, all you're going to see is stalemate. Because I'm telling you, Ukraine is not going to cede any more territory. They've just took back a little territory recently. The summer counteroffensive was never designed to just whip through the Russian lines. I took part in the previous year's counteroffensive in Kyiv, and it was like a lightning bolt to the Russians. We knocked down 3 major cities and 300 villages were liberated in 72 hours. The Russians learned from that. They're not dinosaurs. And they spent a year laying landmines. The Ukrainian Minister of Defense told me just before the counteroffensive kicked off, he said, it's not going to be a lightning bolt like you. It's going to be a metal press across a girder. And we're going to keep pressing and pressing and pressing everywhere until cracks start to appear, the metal starts to deform, and at some point, it's going to break. So that is the determination that the Ukrainians are using. They didn't use NATO tactics. They knew that they couldn't get through all the minefields right away. But we sort of try to paint our idea of what a victory should look like to the people who are actually fighting. Right. They are giving up their men, their women in combat, in blood, and taking back their country centimeter by centimeter. So if we don't give them the support that they have, they still have the European Union. Norway gave them $1 billion in direct defense funds. More money than we are putting in per capita is coming from a country like Norway. Wow. Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are some of the biggest supporters, the tiniest countries in Europe. They understand that if Russia wins, even holds that terrain, and then gets a 4 or 5 year pause and rebuilds its army, its weapons, its stockpiles with new weapons, they could be easily coming into a place where NATO will have to go into direct combat with them. So Ukraine, as I've put this from the very beginning, they are a front line of freedom. They are the eastern wall of democracy. And if that wall breaks, then Putin or whoever follows Putin or other dictators around the world, Xi in China may decide that Taiwan is not nothing. The North Koreans may decide to use one of their rudimentary nuclear weapons, thinking no one will do anything about it because they can't go more than 17, 18 months without feeling exhausted. This is a war that was similar to the one that was fought in World War II. And trust me, I know what it's like to be bombarded for days on end by heavy artillery. But we didn't quit at 1942 when the war started in 1939. The Ukrainians aren't going to quit, and I don't think that the American people will allow it.
So the Ukrainians have displayed the stamina, the staying power. We must play our part to stand in solidarity with them. I had Gary Kasparov in the same seat where you are, and I asked him the question from Ukraine to Gaza. What are we not seeing? What are we missing? I want to throw the same question to you.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question about from Ukraine to Gaza, because one, I spent the overwhelming majority of my career working as a Middle East counterterrorism intelligence collector. So my job was to gain information on our opponents throughout the Middle East. I started in 1983. The second day that I had arrived in Beirut, Lebanon, the American embassy was blown up by a suicide bomber, killing over almost 80 people and simultaneously killing all 9 CIA officers in the embassy. So U.S. intelligence ended that day, except for myself, a few other Arabic-speaking intelligence officials, and a Marine Corps intelligence officer. And so we had to go overload into understanding and studying who our opponents were. My first 8 months, the Western nations, including the United States, lost over 500 people to suicide bombings in Lebanon, And who were we fighting against? Iranian-backed militias, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Palestinian terrorist groups from the PLO, the PFLP, DFLP, a whole myriad of them being supported by Syria. The Israelis who had occupied Lebanon all the way up to Beirut were our allies to a certain extent in this counterterrorism war. We had to deal with the entire myriad of players from Egypt all to Jordan to Syria, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and their inputs into this theater of operations at that time.
Right.
And it was an incredible introduction for a 19-year-old to where I had to understand how these capital players were always there. That dynamic has not changed one bit.
Right.
Except now that with Russia gives an enormous amount of weapon systems, physical support, combat soldiers, fighter aircraft. It even allowed Syria to use nerve gas 300 times in their civil war from 2011 till today, and keep them propped up. At the same time, supporting Iran with weapons and equipment and political support while taking cruise missiles and drones from Iran and firing them into Ukraine. So you have this incestuous triangle there of Syria, Iran, Russia, all of whom support Hezbollah, the same terrorist group that Israel had fought for over a decade. And at the same time, we saw Iran funding Yemen to the south, and then Hamas in the Gaza Strip. All of the weapons Hamas used were Iranian-built weapons or North Korean weapons transshipped through Yemen and other parts, smuggled into the Sinai to Hamas. We also saw photographs and reports that Hamas had trained with members of PMC Wagner, Russia's mercenary group. We have photographs of them wearing patches.
This is, Malcolm, this is something that I haven't heard in the same sentence in the usual conversations. PMC Wagner and Hamas.
You need to understand, PMC Wagner has been operating in North Africa, Central Africa for the last decade with impunity. They have already overthrown 2 governments in the last 2 years that were reliably French, Mali and Niger, right? To the point where they've kicked out French forces from all of those countries and then brought in PMC Wagner mercenaries in uniform there to further Russia's influence. Because Russia wasn't doing it diplomatically. Russia was just killing the leadership of the country with young soldiers that want to have a coup d'etat. Sudan, they helped overthrow the government of Sudan and put it in the crisis that it's in today with direct PMC Wagner mercenaries flying who had come from Ukraine and other parts and took part in the fighting against the government. So you are seeing this axis of autocrats, right? Iran, Syria, Russia, all using PMC Wagner to go out and further speciate Saharan Africa and the Saharan Sahel with other new dictators, many young dictators in uniform, in order to destabilize the West and their support for Ukraine. And we're also just seeing that his biggest sponsor, or the country he sponsors the most, Vladimir Putin, in Latin America, Maduro of Venezuela, is about to invade British Guyana, a place which is, traditionally been known as British Guyana, in order to steal all of their oil fields at the insistent, or let me put it this way, I'm sure at the secret support, with the secret support of Russian intelligence.
How do we win as we close? Your warning to America or your advice to America, how do we win? How do we get out of this, Malcolm?
Yeah, because we're in a very precarious, very dangerous situation as we head into the 2024 election. Because the forces that are out there spend incredible, inordinate amounts of money.
So what do we do?
What do? You have to fight. First off, you have to spread the word. This is going to be the most consequential election in the history of the United States. And it's not about Joe Biden, okay, and Donald Trump. It's about what Joe Biden represents, which is not the status quo, but the continuity of America from George Washington up and down, all of our little foibles, all of our little problems, to have a United States which is an all-inclusive nation in which everyone has a right and a chance to move forward on merit by using the laws, living within the laws, and working as a nation that values its own diversity. The other hand is creating a tribe of white nationalists who have openly said they will rule over 65% of this country and have, Donald Trump jokes about being a dictator. on day one. He's not joking.
You're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day
two. The only way to win this is to win this election across the board, is to vote for the people who stand up for democracy. But we can't, we can only do it in the ballot box.
Malcolm, Nance, thank you so much for being with me on the Frontlines of Freedom. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It is my pleasure too.
Malcolm is an example of a former U.S. military officer who put his experience towards preserving democracy in Ukraine. But now, let's look at another former American military analyst. Unlike Malcolm, this guy is making me say, what the hell, man?
Ladies and gentlemen,
right-wing Trump fascists
to the Russians and the Chinese
are controlled by the same exact people.
completely free of charge.
What the hell, man? I'm not in the tourism business, but it looks like Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, topped off the holiday season's list of destinations for disgraced ex-U.S. military personnel and former UN weapons inspectors who also happen to be shameless boosters for dictators and who also happen to be convicted sex offenders. Sounds like a bit of a niche demographic, huh? But this is actually the precise description of one Scott Ritter. This guy kicked off the new year in the North Caucasus. I mean, when it comes to travel, the pickings must be slim for a guy in Scott's position when I imagine even the neighborhood park is off limits. But it's not just a lack of options that took Scott to a Russian fiefdom where purges of minorities are the norm. He actually supports the leadership there. And no, Scott isn't there with Kris Kringle from the 1970 Christmas special Santa Claus is Coming to Town. That's Ramzan Kadyrov, the brutal warlord who rules Chechnya as a puppet of Vladimir Putin. So while Scott Ritter was in Grozny, he addressed thousands of Chechen soldiers.
Я знаю, вы героем Мариуполь. Я знаю, вы героем Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. Я знаю.
Wait, did he seriously say that Chechens were the heroes of Mariupol, where Russia and its Chechen allies almost completely depopulated a city of 500,000 people, where the Russians bombed a theater full of civilians that had the word children written in huge letters in front of it? Yes, that literally says deity, children in Russian. I guess that's par for the course for a guy who recently had this to say about the situation in the Middle East.
I not only do not condemn Hamas, I applaud Hamas. I endorse Hamas. I am 100% behind Hamas.
100% behind Hamas. Hamas, you know, the murderous Iran-backed terrorists who slaughtered over 1,000 people back in October and are still holding more than 100 hostages in the Gaza Strip. Talk about a broken moral compass. In fact, if you ask me, this guy doesn't have one. Folks, a guy like Scott, this is the profile of a person dictators look for and love when they need supporters. Someone who's desperate and whose sense of right and wrong has clearly been corrupted. Someone who says the Russians are the good guys in Ukraine. And someone who apparently stands behind terrorist organizations like Hamas. I mean, this guy is at the Russian Special Forces Academy. I don't know if he was weird before he got into autocrats or if the autocrats made him weird. But kids, stay away from dictators or you're going to end up with some pretty odd company on your next vacation. And as for you, Scott Ritter, what the hell, man? Now, normally we like to end each edition of Frontlines of Freedom on a hopeful note. Like the original Star Wars, you may recall after a prolonged battle against Darth Vader's seemingly insurmountable galactic empire, Luke Skywalker and his friends in the Rebel Alliance destroyed the Death Star and they saved the day, and they are adorned as conquering heroes. No wonder they called that episode A New Hope. Well, spoiler alert, Today's edition of Frontlines of Freedom ends on a bit more of a cliffhanger. Like, say, the empire strikes back, and it will. So stay with us in 2024 for more hopeful endings. If you haven't yet already done so, subscribe to us on our YouTube channel and follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. I'll see you next time, my friends. Bye-bye.